Before I begin, let me ask you something. Do you like stories that completely flip in the final moments? If you do, then get ready. But there's one important point. YouTube only delivers the ending to subscribers. Without subscribing, you won't understand what really happened. So subscribe now, hit the like button. Today I want to start this video with a special thank you to 3 amazing women whose comments truly touched my heart. Emily Thompson from Portland, Oregon, Jessica Miller from Savannah, Georgia, and Hannah Collins from Cleveland, Ohio. It's such a joy having you here. Tell me, where are you watching from right now? And hold on, because this ending is one of the strongest we've ever shared. The rain hammered against the windows of the penthouse apartment on 5th Avenue in New York City, each droplet a percussion note in a symphony of despair. Inside, behind walls of bulletproof glass and imported marble, a man sat motionless in his custom wheelchair, staring at the city lights below with eyes that had forgotten how to dream. His name was Alexander Constantine Blackwell, and 6 months ago, he had been untouchable. Now, he couldn't even feel his own legs. This story will take you on an emotional journey you won't believe until the very end, a tale of resilience, heartbreak, and the kind of love that defies every impossibility. Don't miss a thing. Subscribe now and discover the ending of this and other thrilling and dramatic stories. What you're about to read will challenge everything you think you know about human determination and the power of connection. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. The accident had happened on a Tuesday. Alexander remembered that detail with crystalline clarity because Tuesdays were supposed to be lucky for him. He had closed 3 major acquisitions on Tuesdays. He had met his former fiancée, Victoria Catherine Montgomery, on a Tuesday. He had even bought his first company on a Tuesday, at the impossibly young age of 24. But this particular Tuesday in March had shattered his entire existence in the span of 3 seconds. The Porsche 911 GT3 RS had been doing 90 on the Pacific Coast Highway when the other driver crossed the median. Alexander's reflexes, honed by years of racing as a hobby, had almost saved him. Almost. The collision sent his car spinning through the guardrail and down a 50-foot embankment. When the paramedics cut him free from the wreckage, they were amazed he was alive. That amazement lasted until the neurologist at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center delivered the verdict that would change everything. Complete spinal cord injury at T12, paralyzed from the waist down. Prognosis: permanent. Victoria had visited him exactly twice in the hospital. The first time, she had cried and held his hand, promising that nothing would change between them. The second time, 2 weeks later, she had returned the engagement ring. It was a vintage Cartier piece that had cost him $250,000. But what crushed him wasn't the monetary loss. It was the look in her eyes as she placed it on the sterile hospital tray beside his bed. Pity mixed with relief. She was escaping, and she knew it, and she was grateful for the socially acceptable excuse his injury provided. 3 months of rehabilitation at Cedars-Sinai had accomplished nothing except depleting his patience and confirming his worst fears. The physical therapists were kind, but ultimately helpless. Against the finality of his condition, they taught him how to transfer from his wheelchair to a bed. They showed him adaptive equipment and modified vehicles. They gave him pamphlets about living with paralysis and support groups for spinal cord injury survivors. What they couldn't give him was hope. Alexander had returned to New York a different man in every sense. The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, had become his prison. His company, Blackwell Capital Management, continued to thrive under the leadership of his vice president. But Alexander found he couldn't summon the energy to care. The deals that once excited him now seemed pointless. The power he had wielded so effortlessly now felt hollow. What was the point of controlling a billion-dollar empire when you couldn't control your own body? His assistant, a competent woman named Patricia, who had been with him for 7 years, had tried everything to pull him out of his depression. She hired a private chef who prepared meals. He didn't eat. She arranged video conferences with business partners he refused to take. She even attempted to set up visits from friends, though Alexander had discovered that his friend list had mysteriously shortened after his accident. Funny how success attracts people and tragedy repels them. The vultures who had circled him at charity galas and business dinners had vanished like smoke when he could no longer walk among them. The worst moments came at 3 a.m. when he woke from dreams where he could still walk, still run, still feel the ground beneath his feet. The transition from dream to reality was brutal every single time. He would lie there in the darkness, trying to will his toes to move, knowing it was futile but unable to stop himself from trying. Some nights he wondered if the paramedics had done him any favors by cutting him free from the wreckage. It was Patricia who finally broke through his isolation, but not with kindness. She had tried that for 3 months. Instead, she walked into his bedroom one morning, yanked open the curtains to let in the painful brightness of a May morning, and said 6 words that changed everything. "I've hired you a physical therapist." Alexander had glared at her from his bed, his jaw tight with anger. They both knew he could fire her. They both also knew he wouldn't, because despite everything, Patricia was the only person left who still treated him like a human being instead of a tragedy. "I don't want another physical therapist," he had said, his voice rough from disuse. "I've had enough of people pretending they can help me while taking my money and offering false hope." "This one is different," Patricia replied, her tone brooking no argument. "She specializes in impossible cases. She's worked with veterans, accident victims, people the medical establishment had written off, and she comes highly recommended by Dr. Morrison from Cedars-Sinai. Dr. Robert Morrison had been Alexander's neurologist, a straight-talking specialist who didn't believe in false hope. If Morrison recommended someone, it meant something. Still, Alexander had wanted to refuse. The problem was that Patricia was already leaving his room, and he heard the front door of the penthouse open moments later. The therapist was already here. Alexander had just enough time to transfer himself into his wheelchair before Patricia returned with a woman who looked nothing like what he had expected. Physical therapists' experience had been cheerful, energetic people who smiled too much and spoke in encouraging tones that grated on his nerves. This woman was different. Her name was Sophia Clara Hartwell, and she walked into his bedroom with the confidence of someone who had seen worse than a bitter billionaire in a wheelchair. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that assessed him with clinical precision. She wore simple scrubs and carried a medical bag that had seen better days. Nothing about her suggested she was impressed by his wealth or his penthouse or his former status as one of New York's most eligible bachelors. "Mr. Blackwell," she said without preamble, extending her hand. "I'm Sophia Hartwell. I understand you've decided to give up." Alexander had stared at her extended hand without taking it, his initial surprise at her bluntness giving way to anger. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Sophia said, lowering her hand without apparent offense. "You've given up. I can see it in the way you're sitting in that chair, in the atrophy of your upper body, in the fact that you haven't shaved in what looks like a week. You've decided that because you can't walk, your life is over. Am I wrong?" "Who the hell do you think you are?" Alexander demanded, his voice rising for the first time in months. "You don't know anything about me or what I've been through. I know you had a T12 complete spinal cord injury 6 months ago," Sophia said, pulling out a tablet and scrolling through what he recognized as his medical records. "I know you spent 12 weeks in rehabilitation at Cedars-Sinai, where you were a model patient for the first 6 weeks, and then became progressively more difficult until the staff were relieved when you checked yourself out. I know your fiancé left you, your friends stopped visiting, and you've been sitting in this penthouse, feeling sorry for yourself ever since. How am I doing so far?" "Get out," Alexander said coldly. "No." The single word hung in the air between them. Alexander couldn't remember the last time someone had refused a direct order from him. Even Patricia, for all her straight talk, had never outright defied him. "I've been paid for 6 months of work," Sophia continued calmly, "and I don't quit. So here's what's going to happen. Every day, Monday through Friday, I'm going to come here at 9 in the morning. I'm going to work with you for 2 hours. You can cooperate, or you can make it difficult. Either way, I'm going to do my job. But I'll tell you this, Mr. Blackwell. I've worked with combat veterans who lost their legs to IEDs in Afghanistan. I've worked with teenagers paralyzed in drunk driving accidents. I've worked with a mother of 3 who broke her spine saving her children from a house fire. Every single one of them wanted to give up at some point, and every single one of them found a reason to keep going. So you can sit there in your expensive wheelchair in your expensive penthouse and tell yourself that your life is over. Or you can decide that maybe, just maybe, there's more to life than walking. She had turned to leave then, but paused at the door. Oh, and Mr. Blackwell? If you're going to fire me, do it now. Otherwise I'll see you tomorrow at 9. Wear something you can exercise in. Alexander had sat there in stunned silence for a full minute after she left. Patricia had hovered in the doorway, clearly expecting him to explode. Instead, he had started laughing. It was a rusty sound, bitter and harsh, but it was the first time he had laughed since the accident. She's insane, he said finally. Patricia had smiled for the first time in weeks. Probably. Should I tell her not to come back? Alexander had surprised himself with his answer. No. Let's see what she's got. Sophia Hartwell arrived at precisely 9 o'clock the next morning as promised. Alexander had debated not getting out of bed, but something about her unflappable confidence had needled him. He found himself up and dressed in athletic shorts and a t-shirt, though he couldn't have explained why he was cooperating. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," she said, setting down her bag and surveying his penthouse gym with approval. Patricia had told him about the gym when he first moved in, a state-of-the-art facility with equipment he hadn't touched in 6 months. Nice setup. "We'll be spending a lot of time in here." "I've been through physical therapy," Alexander said flatly. "It didn't work. Nothing is going to work." The doctors were very clear about that. Sophia pulled out a blood pressure cuff and gestured for him to come closer. "Define work," she said. "Walking," Alexander said, the word bitter in his mouth. "Work would be walking out of this penthouse on my own 2 legs. Sophia wrapped the cuff around his arm and began taking his blood pressure. "That may or may not be possible," she said bluntly. "Complete spinal cord injuries are exactly that. Complete. The neural pathways are severed. But incomplete injuries, which happen more often than you'd think, can show improvement with aggressive therapy. The problem is that initial assessments are often done too early, when swelling and trauma can mask what's really happening in the spine. Sometimes what looks complete is actually incomplete." "The doctors did multiple assessments," Alexander said, but he heard the small note of hope in his voice and hated himself for it. "They were certain. Doctors are certain until they're not," Sophia said, releasing the blood pressure cuff. "Your blood pressure is low, which isn't surprising given your level of activity, or lack thereof. We're going to change that. Starting today, we're going to push your body harder than you've ever pushed it. We're going to work on your core strength, your upper body, your balance. We're going to do standing exercises in a frame to prevent muscle atrophy and maintain bone density. And we're going to do neural stimulation therapy that might, just might, wake up pathways that everyone thinks are dead." "And if it doesn't work?" Alexander asked quietly. "Then you'll be the strongest, healthiest paralyzed man in New York," Sophia said with a small smile. "You'll have better cardiovascular health, better muscle tone, and better mental health than you do right now. You'll be able to do things you can't do now. Transfer more easily. Have more independence. Maybe even participate in adaptive sports if you're interested. Is that so terrible?" Alexander had looked at her for a long moment, trying to find the angle, the manipulation. But her eyes were steady and honest. She wasn't selling him false hope. She was offering him a chance to fight. "All right," he said finally. "Where do we start?" The first month was brutal. Sophia drove him harder than any therapist at Cedars-Sinai had even attempted. She had him doing resistance exercises until his arms shook. She made him work on a specialized standing frame that supported his weight while his legs hung uselessly beneath him. She brought in a TENS unit, a transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation device, and attached electrodes to his legs, sending electrical pulses through muscles that couldn't feel them. Already subscribed? Leave a like and tell us where you're watching from. We want to know where our audience comes from. Alexander hated every second of it. He hated the way his body refused to cooperate. He hated the exhaustion that left him barely able to function after each session. Most of all, he hated the tiny spark of hope that Sophia kept alive despite his best efforts to extinguish it. But something strange began to happen. Sophia didn't just treat his body. She talked to him. Not the careful, therapeutic conversations he'd had with counselors and psychologists. Real conversations. She told him about her patients, about the veterans struggling with PTSD and phantom limb pain, about the teenager who had learned to paint with a brush held in her teeth. She told him about her own life. Growing up in a small town in Vermont, putting herself through school while working 2 jobs, her decision to specialize in rehabilitation therapy after watching her grandfather recover from a stroke. Alexander found himself talking back. At first, it was just responses to her questions, curt and minimal. But gradually, as weeks turned into months, he began to open up. He told her about building his company from nothing, about the thrill of closing his first major deal, about the pressure and loneliness that came with success. He told her about Victoria, about the look in her eyes when she returned the ring, about the friends who had vanished like morning mist. Sophia listened without judgment. She didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. Sometimes she just nodded. Sometimes she called him out on his self-pity. Always she showed up the next day, ready to push him further. It was on a sweltering August morning, 3 months into their sessions, when something impossible happened. Alexander was in the standing frame, his legs supported by braces, going through what had become a familiar routine. Sophia was adjusting the TENS unit settings, increasing the intensity of the electrical pulses. "Tell me if you feel anything different," she said, as she always did, expecting nothing. And then Alexander felt it, a tingling sensation in his right leg, faint as a whisper, but unmistakable. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it, that his mind was playing cruel tricks. But the sensation persisted, growing slightly stronger. "Stop," he said, his voice tight. Sophia froze immediately, her professional instincts kicking in. "What's wrong? I feel something. In my right leg. It's like pins and needles." Sophia's face went very still. She moved around to look at his leg, her hand hovering over his right thigh. "I'm going to touch you," she said. "Tell me if you feel it." She pressed her fingers against his skin, and Alexander gasped. "I feel that. I actually feel that." The professional mask slipped from Sophia's face for just a moment, replaced by something that looked like wonder. "Can you try to move your toes? Don't force it. Just try." Alexander focused every ounce of his concentration on his right foot. For long seconds, nothing happened. Then, so slightly that he almost missed it, his big toe twitched. It was the smallest movement imaginable, barely visible, but it was real. "Oh my God," Sophia whispered. She looked up at him, and he saw tears in her eyes. "Alexander, you just moved your toe." The next months were a blur of activity. Sophia immediately contacted Dr. Morrison, who ordered a new battery of tests. The MRI showed what the initial scans had missed in the chaos following his accident. There was a small amount of neural tissue that had survived the trauma, a tiny bridge across the damaged area. It wasn't much, but combined with the aggressive therapy and neural stimulation, it had been enough to begin forming new pathways. "It's an incomplete injury," Dr. Morrison had said, his professional demeanor cracking to reveal genuine excitement. "This is extremely rare, Mr. Blackwell. The initial assessment was done 72 hours post-accident, when there was still significant swelling and trauma. What looked complete was actually incomplete. With continued therapy, there's a chance, I'm not promising anything, but there's a legitimate chance of recovery." The words that Alexander had stopped letting himself think suddenly became possible again. Recovery. Walking. Life. But Sophia tempered his excitement with her characteristic bluntness. "This doesn't mean you'll walk tomorrow or next month or even next year," she said. "This means we have something to work with. But it's going to take time, probably years. And it's going to be harder than anything you've done so far. The question is whether you're willing to do the work." Alexander had looked at her, at this woman who had refused to give up on him when he had given up on himself, and felt something shift in his chest. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. The therapy intensified. Sophia increased their sessions to 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. She brought in specialized equipment, consulted with other specialists, designed exercises specifically targeted at rebuilding the neural connections. Alexander threw himself into the work with an intensity that surprised even him. The business that had once consumed his life became secondary. Patricia handled the day-to-day operations, while Alexander focused on the only goal that mattered: walking again. Progress came in tiny increments. A month after that first toe movement, he could flex his right foot. 2 months later, he had sensation in both legs, though the left remained significantly weaker than the right. 4 months after that, he could tense his thigh muscles, creating small movements that would have been imperceptible to anyone not watching closely. It was during these months of grueling work that Alexander began to see Sophia differently. At first, she had been just another therapist, albeit a more effective one. Then she had become a drill sergeant, pushing him past limits he didn't think he had. But somewhere along the way, she had become something more. He found himself looking forward to their sessions not just for the therapy, but for her presence. He noticed the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating, the small dimple that appeared when she smiled at a particularly good result, the way her eyes lit up when she explained a new technique. He noticed how she never wore makeup but didn't need it, how her hands were strong but gentle, how she could make him laugh even when he was exhausted and frustrated. More than that, he realized that Sophia saw him. Not Alexander Blackwell, the billionaire CEO, not the tragic accident victim, not even the patient struggling to recover. She saw the man he actually was, stripped of all the trappings of wealth and power and physical ability. And somehow, inexplicably, she seemed to like what she saw. They talked about everything during those long sessions: politics and philosophy, books and movies, dreams and fears. Sophia told him about the patients she couldn't save, the ones who gave up or whose injuries were too severe. She told him about her fear that she was becoming too emotionally invested in her work, that she was giving so much to her patients that she had nothing left for herself. Alexander found himself sharing things he had never told anyone. His complicated relationship with his father, a self-made man who had expected Alexander to be perfect. His fear that his success had been more about proving something to his father than about any real passion for business. His realization that the accident, horrible as it was, had freed him from a life he wasn't sure he had actually wanted. One evening, about 10 months into their work together, Alexander asked Sophia to stay for dinner. It was a Friday, and Patricia had left for the weekend. The penthouse was quiet, except for the distant hum of the city below. "I should go," Sophia said, but there was hesitation in her voice. "Please," Alexander said. "I'd like the company, and I promise I can order takeout that's worth staying for." She had smiled then, that small dimple appearing. "All right, but I'm not staying late. I have another patient at 8 tomorrow morning." They had ended up talking until midnight. Alexander ordered Thai food from a place Sophia recommended, and they ate at the dining table that overlooked Central Park. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did, but there was something different in the air, a charge, an awareness. When Sophia finally stood to leave, Alexander wheeled himself to the door with her. At the threshold, she paused. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly. "I can't remember the last time I just relaxed and talked." "Thank you," Alexander said, "for everything, for not giving up on me, for pushing me, for seeing me." Something passed between them in that moment, unspoken but undeniable. Sophia reached down and touched his hand briefly, then left before either of them could acknowledge what was happening. Just one click, subscribe, leave a like and say where you're watching from. Your support is essential for our growth. Alexander lay in bed that night, unable to sleep. He was falling in love with Sophia Hartwell. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. She was his therapist. The professional boundary was clear. But more than that, what could he possibly offer her? He was still in a wheelchair, still dependent, still broken in fundamental ways. What right did he have to feel this way about someone who deserved so much more? The months that followed were a strange dance of proximity and distance. Their therapy sessions continued with the same intensity, but there was an undercurrent now, an awareness that neither acknowledged. Sometimes their hands would touch during an exercise, and the contact would linger just a moment too long. Sometimes Alexander would catch Sophia looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Sometimes their conversations would veer into territory that felt more intimate than professional. 1 year after that first toe movement, Alexander stood unassisted for 5 seconds. His legs shook with the effort, and he immediately collapsed back into his wheelchair. But those 5 seconds represented a miracle. Sophia had been documenting every milestone with photographs and videos, building a record of his progress. When she showed him the footage of that 5-second stand, he saw tears streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered. "Alexander, you actually did it." "We did it," he corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you." She had looked at him then with such raw emotion that Alexander's breath caught. For a moment, he thought she might kiss him. Instead, she turned away, wiping her eyes. "This is what I do," she said, her voice thick. "This is why I do this." But Alexander knew it was more than that. He knew because he felt it too, this connection that went beyond therapist and patient, beyond professional duty. He knew because he had started to recognize the signs. The way Sophia found excuses to extend their sessions. The way she showed up on Sundays, her supposed day off, with new exercises to try. The way she talked about her other patients less and less, as if this penthouse had become her entire world. It was Patricia who finally called them out. She had watched their relationship evolve over the 18 months of therapy, had seen what they seemed determined not to acknowledge. One evening, after Sophia had left, she walked into the gym where Alexander was doing cool-down stretches. "Are you going to tell her?" Patricia asked, without preamble. "Tell her what?" Alexander said, though he knew exactly what Patricia meant. "That you're in love with her. Don't insult my intelligence by denying it. I've been watching you two dance around each other for months. It's painful." Alexander had stopped stretching, his hands gripping the bars of his wheelchair. "It doesn't matter what I feel. She's my therapist. There's a professional boundary. And even if there wasn't, look at me, Patricia. I can stand for 5 seconds at a time. What do I have to offer someone like her?" Patricia had walked over and crouched down, so she was at his eye level. "Alexander Blackwell," she said firmly, "for a brilliant man. You can be incredibly stupid. That woman looks at you like you hung the moon. She's not here because you're paying her. In fact, I happen to know she turned down a position at Mayo Clinic to continue working with you. She's here because she cares about you. And if you can't see that, then maybe you don't deserve her." "Wait," Alexander said, his mind catching on something Patricia had said. "She turned down Mayo Clinic?" Patricia nodded. 6 months ago, they offered her a position as their head of rehabilitation therapy. It's the kind of opportunity that doesn't come along twice. She said no without even discussing it with you. Said she had a commitment to see through. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Sophia had sacrificed a career-making opportunity for him. She had chosen him over everything else, and he had been too caught up in his own insecurities to see it. The next morning, Alexander was up before dawn. He had been practicing something in secret for the past month, working on it during the hours when Sophia wasn't there. It was a surprise, though he hadn't been sure when or if he would reveal it. Now seemed like the time. When Sophia arrived at 9, she found Alexander standing at the door to greet her. Not in his wheelchair, not supported by the standing frame. Just standing, his legs shaking with effort but holding his weight. Sophia froze, her bag dropping from her hand. "Alexander," she breathed. "How long have you been able to do that?" "About 30 seconds so far," he said, his voice strained with effort. "But that's not the impressive part. Watch." He took a step. It was clumsy and uncertain, his left leg dragging slightly, but it was a step, then another, and another. 5 steps total before his legs gave out and he had to catch himself on the doorframe. But it was enough. Sophia was crying. She rushed forward to help him, but Alexander held up a hand. "Wait," he said. "There's something I need to tell you first." He took a deep breath, still leaning against the doorframe. "Patricia told me about Mayo Clinic, about the position you turned down. Why didn't you tell me?" Sophia's tears stopped, replaced by a guardedness he had never seen in her before. "It wasn't relevant to your treatment," she said carefully. "Sophia," Alexander said gently, "please, no more professional distance. No more pretending this is just therapist and patient. I need to know why." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her carefully constructed, walls beginning to crumble. "Because I couldn't leave you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told myself it was professional commitment, that I had started your treatment and needed to see it through. But that was a lie. The truth is, somewhere between that first day when I told you that you had given up and now, I fell in love with you. And I know it's inappropriate. I know I've crossed every professional boundary, but I couldn't stop it. I tried. God knows I tried. But you're the first thing I think about in the morning and the last thing I think about at night. You're the reason I turned down my dream job. You're the reason I show up here even when I'm exhausted. You're the reason I've been breaking my own heart for months because I couldn't have you. Because you were my patient, and because you deserved someone who wasn't broken." "Wait," Alexander said, pushing off from the doorframe. He swayed, but he managed to take 2 more steps closer to her. "You think you're the broken one in this equation?" Sophia let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. "You're standing, Alexander. You're walking. You're one of the most brilliant, determined people I've ever met. And I'm just a therapist who couldn't maintain professional boundaries." "You're the woman who saved my life," Alexander said. "Not just my body, Sophia. My life. I was done when you walked into this penthouse. I had given up, and you refused to let me go. You pushed me when I needed pushing, you listened when I needed someone to hear me. You saw me when everyone else only saw the wheelchair. I fell in love with you somewhere around month 2, probably earlier if I'm honest. I've spent the last year trying to figure out how to tell you, trying to become someone worthy of you." "Alexander," Sophia whispered. "I'm still going to need a cane for probably the rest of my life," he continued. "I may never run a marathon or dance at a wedding, but if you'll have me, if you can see past all of that, I promise I will spend every day being grateful that you walked into my life and refused to give up on me." Sophia closed the distance between them in 3 quick steps. She wrapped her arms around him, and he felt her tears against his chest. "I don't need you to be perfect," she said. "I just need you to be you." Alexander held her, his legs already beginning to shake with the effort of standing, but he didn't care. This moment was worth any amount of pain. "Then you should probably know that I'm about to fall over," he said with a laugh. Sophia laughed too, a sound of pure joy, and helped ease him into his wheelchair. But she didn't let go of his hand. They sat there in the doorway, fingers intertwined, neither speaking, but both finally acknowledging what had been building between them for 18 months. The next 6 months transformed everything. Sophia officially ended their therapeutic relationship, referring Alexander to another physical therapist for his continued treatment. She wanted there to be no question of impropriety, no suggestion that their relationship was anything but genuine. Alexander was frustrated at first, missing their sessions together. but he understood. Some boundaries needed to be respected. They dated like normal people, or as normal as possible, given their circumstances. Sophia moved into the penthouse 6 months after their confession, though she kept her own apartment for appearance's sake. They went to restaurants, to movies, to concerts. Alexander still used his wheelchair for longer distances, but he was walking with a cane for short periods. Each day brought new progress, new small victories. Alexander also returned to work, but with a different perspective. He restructured his company to focus on investments in medical technology and rehabilitation research. He established a foundation to provide funding for spinal cord injury research and to help accident victims afford the kind of intensive therapy that had saved his life. The business still mattered to him, but it was no longer the only thing that defined him. Sophia continued her work as a physical therapist, though she was more selective about her clients. She focused on the hardest cases, the patients that other therapists had given up on. She used Alexander's story, with his permission, to give hope to people who needed it. She also began teaching, sharing her techniques with other therapists, determined to spread the kind of knowledge that could change lives. 2 years after that first toe movement, exactly 24 months after the moment that had changed everything, Alexander took Sophia to dinner at Daniel, one of New York's finest restaurants. She knew something was different when he insisted on walking from the car to the restaurant, refusing his wheelchair even though it meant a slow, careful journey on his cane. The maître d' had reserved them a private table in the back, and Alexander had specifically requested champagne be waiting. "What's going on?" Sophia asked as they settled into their seats. "You're acting strange." Alexander smiled, that dimple that she loved appearing in his cheek. "Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me?" Sophia thought back to that day 2.5 years ago. "I told you that you had given up." "And I had," Alexander said. "I had given up on walking, on living, on ever being happy again. And then you walked into my life and refused to let me quit. You saved me, Sophia. Not just physically, though God knows you did that too. You saved the part of me that matters. You saw the man I could be when I couldn't see it myself." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Sophia's breath caught. "Alexander," she whispered. "I know we've only been officially together for 1.5 years, Alexander said, "and I know that by traditional standards this might seem fast. But Sophia, I've loved you from almost the beginning. I've watched you give everything to help, not just me, but every patient who walks through your door. I've seen your strength, your compassion, your unwavering belief that people can change and heal and grow. And I want to spend the rest of my life being the kind of man who deserves that kind of love." He opened the box to reveal a ring that made Sophia gasp. It wasn't ostentatious like the ring he had given Victoria. This was a simple platinum band with a single perfect diamond, elegant and timeless. "Sophia Clara Hartwell, will you marry me?" "Not because I can walk now, but because you loved me when I couldn't. Not because I'm rich, but because you see past all of that to who I really am. Marry me because we're better together than we ever could be apart." Sophia was crying, happy tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Alexander. 1,000 times yes." Alexander slipped the ring on her finger, and it fit perfectly. He had asked Patricia to secretly measure one of Sophia's other rings months ago, planning this moment down to the smallest detail. Then, using his cane for support, he stood and pulled Sophia up with him. They stood there in the middle of the restaurant, holding each other, as the other diners applauded. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. It was May, and the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. Sophia wore a simple ivory dress that she had found in a vintage shop in the village. Alexander wore a custom suit and walked her down the aisle himself, using only a cane for support. It wasn't the grand society wedding that people might have expected from Alexander Constantin Blackwell, but it was perfect. Patricia served as Sophia's maid of honor, and Dr. Morrison stood up as Alexander's best man. There were perhaps 50 people in attendance, each one someone who truly mattered to them. No business associates invited out of obligation, no socialites there to be seen. Just friends and family and the therapists and doctors who had been part of Alexander Zhou's journey. During the reception, Alexander gave a speech that left not a single dry eye in the garden. "I was asked by several people to prepare something appropriate for today," he began. "Something dignified and respectful and properly brief. So here it is. Thank you all for coming. Please enjoy the food." He paused as the audience laughed. But I can't actually stop there, because there's something I need to say. 3 years ago, I thought my life was over. I was paralyzed, bitter, and certain that I had nothing left to live for. I had built an empire, but I was empty inside. And then Sophia walked into my penthouse and told me I had given up. She was right. But more than that, she refused to let me stay given up. Alexander looked at Sophia, who was crying and smiling at the same time. This woman, this incredible, stubborn, brilliant woman, saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. She worked with me every single day for 18 months. She pushed me, challenged me, refused to accept my excuses. But more than that, she saw me. Not Alexander Blackwell, the CEO. Not the accident victim. Not the patient. Just me. And somehow, inexplicably, she loved what she saw. He turned back to the audience. People talk about miracles, and they assume I'm referring to the fact that I can walk again. But that's not the miracle. The miracle is standing right here beside me. The miracle is that in my darkest moment, when I had given up on everything, love found me anyway. The miracle is that Sophia Hartwell said yes when I asked her to spend her life with me. I will spend every day trying to be worthy of that gift. The first year of their marriage was a period of profound adjustment and joy. Sophia had officially left private practice to pursue a new dream. Inspired by Alexander's recovery and her work with other patients, she decided to return to school to become a physician. It was something she had considered before becoming a physical therapist, but had dismissed as too expensive and time-consuming. Now, with Alexander's support, both emotional and financial, she enrolled in medical school at Columbia University. It wasn't easy. Medical school never is. But Sophia approached it with the same determination she had brought to Alexander's rehabilitation. She studied late into the night, often falling asleep over textbooks in their library. Alexander would find her there, carefully mark her place, and carry her to bed. On her hardest days, when she questioned whether she was making the right choice, Alexander would remind her of what she had once told him, that giving up wasn't an option. Alexander, meanwhile, had fully embraced his new role as an advocate for disability rights and medical research. The foundation he had established had grown significantly, funding cutting-edge research into spinal cord injuries and providing scholarships for patients who couldn't afford the kind of intensive therapy he had received. He testified before Congress about the need for increased funding for medical research. He visited rehabilitation centers around the country, talking to patients and families, sharing his story. He never pretended that his recovery was typical or that everyone would have the same results. He was always honest about the fact that he had been extraordinarily lucky, both in his injury being incomplete and in finding Sophia. But he emphasized that luck wasn't the whole story. Recovery required work, determination, and refusing to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. 4 years after the accident, 7 years after their first meeting, Sophia graduated from medical school. Alexander was in the audience, walking without his cane for the first time in years. His gait would never be perfect. There was still a slight limp that he had learned to accept. But he could walk, and that was more than anyone had thought possible. Sophia chose to specialize in physical medicine and rehabilitation, wanting to help patients like Alexander. She completed her residency at the Rusk Rehabilitation at NYU Langone, working with patients who had suffered traumatic injuries, strokes, and neurological conditions. She brought to her work not just medical knowledge, but the deep understanding that came from having walked the journey with someone she loved. Her first patient as an attending physician was a 19-year-old woman named Emma, who had been paralyzed in a diving accident. Emma was angry and bitter, refusing to participate in her therapy, insisting that her life was over. Sophia sat down beside Emma's bed and told her a story about a man who had given up, about a therapist who had refused to let him, and about the long, difficult journey they had taken together. "I can't promise you that you'll walk again," Sophia said. "I can't promise that therapy will give you back everything you've lost. But I can promise you this. Giving up guarantees you'll never get better. Fighting, even when it seems hopeless, at least gives you a chance. And sometimes, Emma, sometimes chance is enough." Emma had started crying then, and Sophia had held her hand just as she had once held Alexander's. It was the beginning of Emma's recovery, though the journey would be long and difficult. But Sophia was patient. She had learned patience from the best. Alexander often visited Sophia at the hospital, sometimes bringing lunch, sometimes just stopping by to say hello. The staff quickly learned that the well-dressed man with the slight limp was Dr. Hartwell's husband, and they loved the way his face lit up whenever he saw her. More than one nurse commented that they were relationship goals. One afternoon, about a year into Sophia's practice, Alexander arrived to find her sitting in her office with tears streaming down her face. He rushed to her side, terrified that something terrible had happened. "What's wrong?" he asked urgently. "Sophia, talk to me." She looked up at him, and he realized she was smiling through her. Tears. "Nothing's wrong," she said. "Everything is perfect. Emma walked today." She actually walked, Alexander. 10 steps without any support. She's been in a wheelchair for 14 months, and today she walked. Alexander pulled her into his arms, understanding completely. This was what it had been like for Sophia watching him take those first steps. This was the joy and relief and triumph of witnessing the impossible become possible. "You gave her hope," he said softly, "just like you gave it to me." "We gave her hope," Sophia corrected, echoing the words Alexander had once said to her. "None of this would be possible without you. Your foundation funded the equipment we used. Your story gave her something to believe in. We did this together." Years continued to pass, marked by small moments of joy and triumph. Sophia built a reputation as one of the finest rehabilitation specialists in New York, known for taking on the most difficult cases and never giving up on her patients. Alexander's foundation expanded, opening rehabilitation centers in 3 states and funding research that led to breakthrough treatments for spinal cord injuries. They faced challenges, of course. There were days when Alexander's old injuries flared up, when the pain in his back was so intense that he was confined to bed. There were nights when Sophia came home from the hospital devastated because she had lost a patient. There were moments of doubt and frustration and fear. But they faced everything together. When Alexander had bad days, Sophia was there with heating pads and gentle hands and unwavering support. When Sophia struggled with the weight of her work, Alexander reminded her of the lives she had changed, of the hope she gave to people who had none. 10 years after the accident, Alexander and Sophia returned to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden on their anniversary. It was May again, and the cherry blossoms were once more in full bloom. They walked through the gardens together, Alexander's limp barely noticeable now, their hands intertwined. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked as they sat on a bench overlooking the pond. "Giving up Mayo Clinic, spending all those months with a bitter man in a wheelchair, changing your entire career path?" Sophia turned to look at him, her eyes soft with love. "Not for a single second," she said. "Alexander, you changed my life as much as I changed yours. You taught me what real strength looks like. You showed me that love isn't about perfection or easy answers. You gave me a purpose beyond just treating patients. You gave me a partner, a best friend, a reason to believe in miracles." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Besides," she added with a smile, "Mayo Clinic is overrated. I'd rather be here with you." Alexander kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with the cherry blossoms. I love you, Sophia Clara Blackwell. I loved you when I couldn't walk. I love you now that I can. I'll love you forever, no matter what. And I love you, she replied. You impossible, stubborn, wonderful man. They sat there as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that rivaled the cherry blossoms. Two people who had found each other in the darkest moment, who had refused to give up on each other or themselves, who had built a life together that was more beautiful than either had imagined possible. The accident that had shattered Alexander's spine had also broken open his life in ways that turned out to be blessings. It had stripped away the superficial relationships and shallow pursuits that had defined his existence. It had forced him to discover who he really was when everything else was taken away. And in that discovery, he had found Sophia. For Sophia, meeting Alexander had transformed her understanding of what healing meant. It wasn't just about fixing bodies or restoring function. It was about seeing the whole person, about refusing to give up even when the odds seemed impossible, about believing that sometimes the greatest healing came not from medicine, but from love. Together, they had created something larger than either of them. The foundation Alexander had established with Sophia's guidance had changed countless lives. The patients Sophia treated carried forward the message that giving up was never the answer. Their story, shared at medical conferences and rehabilitation centers, gave hope to people who needed it most. But more than any of that, they had each other. They had built a marriage based not on perfection, but on perseverance, not on ease, but on effort, not on avoiding difficulty, but on facing it together. They had learned that love wasn't just about the good times. It was about showing up during the hard times, about being there when walking away would be easier, about choosing each other every single day. As they left the garden that evening, walking hand in hand through the gate, Alexander paused and looked back at the cherry blossoms one more time. Sophia, he said thoughtfully, do you remember what I told you on our wedding day? About miracles? You said I was the miracle, Sophia replied, smiling at the memory. Alexander shook his head. I was wrong. You're not the miracle. This is us. This life we've built. The fact that something as terrible as that accident could lead to something as beautiful as this. That's the real miracle. Not that I can walk again, that I found you, that you loved me enough to never give up, that we get to spend our lives together helping other people find their own miracles. Sophia blinked back tears. Sometimes, Alexander Constantine Blackwell, you say exactly the right thing. I learned from the best, he said, pulling her close. They walked home through the streets of Brooklyn, two people who had found each other in the most unexpected way, who had fought through impossible odds, who had chosen love when giving up would have been easier. Behind them, the cherry blossoms continued to bloom, a reminder that even after the harshest winter, spring always comes. Even in the darkest moments, hope persists. And sometimes, just sometimes, miracles happen to those who refuse to give up. Years would pass. There would be more challenges, more triumphs, more ordinary days that made up an extraordinary life. Alexander's foundation would continue to grow, eventually becoming one of the leading funders of spinal cord injury research in the country. Sophia would become head of rehabilitation medicine at her hospital, training a new generation of doctors in the philosophy that had saved Alexander's life. Never give up on a patient, because you never know what's possible until you try. They would face more dark times. There would be days when Alexander's pain was so intense that he could barely function. There would be nights when Sophia would lose a patient and come home questioning everything. There would be moments when the weight of their work and their own struggles seemed too much to bear. But they would face all of it together, as they had from that first day when Sophia had walked into Alexander's penthouse and refused to accept his surrender. They had learned that love wasn't just about the moments of triumph. It was about showing up during the failures, the setbacks, the ordinary, difficult days that test every relationship. It was about choosing each other over and over again, even when, especially when, it was hard. And through it all, they would remember that moment in the doorway of the penthouse, when Alexander had taken his first steps in over a year, when Sophia had finally admitted that she loved him, when two people who had been lost had found each other. That moment had changed everything. It had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come from refusing to accept defeat, that sometimes love finds you exactly when you've stopped looking for it, that sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you didn't know you needed. Alexander Constantine Blackwell had been a man who had everything and lost it all in 3 seconds. Sophia Clara Hartwell had been a therapist who specialized in impossible cases. Together, they had proved that nothing is truly impossible if you're willing to fight for it. They had shown that the human spirit, when combined with love and determination, can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. They had demonstrated that sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you can lead to the best thing that ever happens to you. Their story would inspire countless others. Patients who were ready to give up would hear about the CEO who learned to walk again and find the strength to try one more day. Therapists who were burning out would remember the woman who refused to accept defeat and renew their commitment to their patients. People who had lost hope would learn about Alexander and Sophia and dare to believe that maybe, just maybe, their own miracles were possible. But for Alexander and Sophia themselves, the real miracle wasn't the recovery or the foundation or the lives they had changed. The real miracle was simpler and more profound. It was waking up next to each other every morning. It was the way Sophia still bit her lip when she was concentrating. It was the way Alexander still looked at her like she had hung the moon. It was the ordinary moments of an extraordinary love, the small daily choices to show up and be present and never give up on each other. On to their 15th wedding anniversary, Alexander and Sophia returned once more to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. They were older now, with gray beginning to show in Sophia's dark hair and deeper lines around Alexander's eyes. His limp was more pronounced than it had been, the inevitable result of age and old injuries. But he still walked, and that would never stop being remarkable. They sat on the same bench where they had sat so many times before, watching the cherry blossoms dance in the spring breeze. Around them, families played and couples walked hand in hand and children ran along the paths. It was an ordinary day in an ordinary place, but for Alexander and Sophia, it was perfect. "Sophia," Alexander said quietly, "I want to tell you something." She turned to him, still beautiful in his eyes, still the woman who had saved his life in every way that mattered. "What is it?" "Sometimes I think about that day when you first walked into my penthouse," he said. "I was so angry with you. You were blunt and demanding, and you refused to let me wallow in my self-pity. I wanted to fire you immediately, and now I can't imagine my life without you. Isn't that strange? The person who made me the angriest became the person I love the most." Sophia smiled, that dimple appearing that he still loved after all these years. "It's not strange at all," she said. "Sometimes the people who challenge us the most are the ones we need the most. You needed someone who wouldn't accept your excuses. And I needed someone who would remind me why I do this work, why it matters, why I should never give up on a patient." "We saved each other," Alexander said softly. "Yes," Sophia agreed. "We did. And we'll keep saving each other, every day, for the rest of our lives." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the cherry blossoms fall like snow around them. Somewhere in the city, a patient was taking their first steps after months of paralysis. Somewhere, a doctor was refusing to give up on a seemingly hopeless case. Somewhere, two people were finding each other in the most unexpected way. The story of Alexander and Sophia would continue long after this perfect spring afternoon. There would be more anniversaries, more challenges overcome, more lives changed. Their foundation would fund the research that would lead to breakthrough treatments, making recoveries like Alexander's more common. Sophia would publish a landmark study on rehabilitation techniques that would become required reading in medical schools. Together, They would prove that the greatest healing comes not from medicine alone, but from the combination of science and human connection, of technique and compassion, of refusing to give up and daring to love. But in that moment, sitting on a bench in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden with cherry blossoms falling around them, they weren't a CEO and a doctor, a patient and a therapist, a miracle and its architect. They were simply Alexander and Sophia, two people who had found each other, when they needed it most, who had refused to give up on each other or themselves, who had built a life together that was more beautiful than either had dared to imagine. And that, perhaps, is the real lesson of their story. Not that all paralysis can be overcome with enough work. Not that love conquers all obstacles. But that sometimes, in our darkest moments, when we've given up on ourselves, someone else refuses to give up on us. And in that refusal, in that stubborn insistence that we are worth fighting for, we find the strength to keep going. We find hope. We find love. We find miracles. Alexander reached for Sophia's hand, and she laced her fingers through his. After all these years, the touch still sent warmth through him. After all the challenges they had faced, after all the triumphs and setbacks, this simple connection remained the most important thing in his life. "Ready to go home?" Sophia asked. Alexander nodded, standing and pulling her up with him. Together, they walked. Toward the gate, leaving behind the cherry blossoms and the memories and the ghosts of who they had been before they found each other. Ahead of them lay home and dinner and an evening spent in comfortable companionship and all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that made up their life together. The sun was setting as they reached the street, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Alexander paused, looking back one last time at the garden where they had been married, where they had returned year after year to remember and celebrate and simply be together. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Sophia asked. "For not giving up on me. For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For loving me. For this life. For everything." Sophia squeezed his hand. "Thank you for not giving up on yourself. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for letting me love you. Thank you for this beautiful life we've built together." They kissed then, a sweet, gentle kiss that held within it all the years of struggle and triumph, all the love that had grown from that first contentious meeting, all the promises they had made and kept. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling. "Come on," Sophia said, tugging his hand. "Let's go home." And so they did. They walked home through the streets of Brooklyn as the light faded and the city came alive with evening. They walked past couples and families, past strangers living their own stories of struggle and triumph. They walked together, as they had for 15 years, as they would for all the years to come. Behind them, the cherry blossoms continued to bloom in the gathering darkness. Above them, the first stars began to appear in the deepening sky. Around them, the city pulsed with life and possibility. And ahead of them lay home, and love, and all the beautiful, ordinary moments that make up an extraordinary life. This is the story of a man who lost everything and found what truly mattered. This is the story of a woman who refused to accept defeat and discovered love in the most unexpected place. This is the story of two people who proved that sometimes the greatest miracles come not from divine intervention but from human determination, from refusing to give up, from choosing each other every single day. It is a story of paralysis and recovery, of despair and hope, of giving up and refusing to give up. But most of all, it is a story of love. Not the easy, simple love of fairy tales, but the hard, complicated, beautiful love of real life. The love that shows up every day. The love that refuses to quit. The love that sees you at your worst and chooses to stay. The love that believes in you when you've stopped believing in yourself. Alexander Constantine Blackwell had been paralyzed from the waist down, abandoned by everyone he thought cared about him, bitter and broken and certain his life was over. Sophia Clara Hartwell had been a physical therapist who specialized in impossible cases, who had seen too many people give up, who had almost lost her own faith in her work. Together, they had created something miraculous. Not just Alexander's recovery, though that was remarkable. Not just Sophia's transformation from therapist to doctor, though that was inspiring. But a partnership, a marriage, a love that proved that sometimes the worst things lead to the best things. That sometimes when everything falls apart, it's making room for something better to be built. That sometimes the person who saves your life is the one you didn't know you were waiting for. Years from now, when medical students study Sophia's groundbreaking research, they will learn about the techniques that made recoveries like Alexander's possible. When aspiring therapists read about her methods, they will understand the importance of never giving up on a patient. When people hear about the Blackwell Foundation and the lives it has changed, they will appreciate the power of using privilege to help others. But the real legacy of Alexander and Sophia won't be found in medical journals or foundation reports. It will be found in the small, quiet moments, in the way they still hold hands after all these years, in the way they still look at each other like they're the only two people in the world, in the way they still choose each other every single day, no matter what. It will be found in the patients who hear their story and find the courage to try one more day, in the therapists who remember the woman who refused to accept defeat and renew their commitment to their patients, in the couples who face their own challenges and remember that love isn't about perfection, but about perseverance. And it will be found in the simple truth that sometimes, when we've given up on ourselves, when we're certain there's no hope left, when everything seems impossible, that's exactly when miracles happen. Not because we deserve them, not because we've earned them, but because someone, somewhere, refuses to give up on us. Because someone sees past our brokenness to the person we could be. Because someone loves us enough to fight for us when we can't fight for ourselves. Alexander and Sophia walk through their front door, home at last. Tomorrow there will be patients to see, and meetings to attend, and the ordinary business of life. But tonight, there is just the two of them, together, grateful for every moment of this unexpected, beautiful life they have built. And somewhere in New York, a patient in a wheelchair is hearing their story for the first time and daring to hope. Somewhere, a therapist is deciding not to give up on a difficult case. Somewhere, two people who haven't met yet are moving toward each other, drawn together by forces they don't understand, about to discover their own miracle. Because that's what stories like this do. They ripple outward, touching lives in ways we can never fully measure. They remind us that giving up is never the answer. They show us that love can be found in the most unexpected places. They prove that sometimes the worst day of your life is the first day of your best life. You just don't know it yet. This is their story. A story of falling and rising, of breaking and healing, of giving up and refusing to give up, of finding love in the ruins of a life and building something more beautiful than what was lost. A story that proves that sometimes when everything falls apart, it's making room for something better. That sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you leads directly to the best thing. That sometimes miracles are real. And most importantly, a story that reminds us all that hope, love, and determination can overcome even the most impossible odds. That we are never truly broken beyond repair. That the end of one chapter is simply the beginning of another. That life, in all its complexity and pain and beauty, is always, always worth fighting for.